Taken out of their basement dance party context, rave music like techno, house, or other electronic music just loses something. Something feels off when you're listening to dance music while sitting in your couch. But there are outliers though. You can still put on some Underworld's Dark and Long to fill a moody, rainy evening or do some work or study to. Minimalistic Detroit techno can be good background music for some productivity as well. I Hate Models is my favorite gym music, up there with Gojira's The Way of All Flesh. The ways you can lose yourself in any given Aphex Twin record requires no additional comments. Some electronic music takes you on a journey, no matter what the context of the listening experience is. With enough effort, electronic albums that transcend dance floors are one step short of being a concept album. One of my favorite of such prog rock-esque experiences can be found in the discography of Moa Pillar, a techno act from Russia. At some point in the 2010s, a new postmodern sound for a postmodern age was birthed. Deconstructed Club, as it became known, was a sound design forward autopsy of the dance floor trends and sounds of the past. A dark and twisted wave of artists aiming at weirding out the listeners more than stimulating them. Think contemporary angular sound design spliced with samples and a somewhat crooked visage of EDM trends. Together with the synonymous drum and bass oriented post-grime, neo-grime subgenres, Deconstructed Club was the lesser known and less popular variant of hyperpop. A feature that really closed the genre off for me was their complete break with actually making danceable music. The beats, the rhythms were all but broken, crushed by the postmodern attempt at sound art. Deconstructed Club was separated, severed from the dance floor. A somewhat alienating experience, as the rhythm wasn't the only thing flying out the door. Think of Arca's 2015 Mutant LP. Adventurous and bold sound design, yes, but not much else. No songwriting and no emotional immersion in the experience that the album gives you. The experience is more of an acoustic experiment than a collection of songs that aspire to evoke any emotion in you. That is not to say that the whole deconstructed subspace is or was useless, in my opinion, but it was undeniably alienating. The younger brooding brother ended his nihilist phase and decided to return home. When his journey yielded nothing, he returned back into the homely embrace of fond memories, traditions, and the ordinary, bringing some part of the streets with him. The best practices of postmodern cut-up sound design were rejuvenated by classic techno structures and forms. The experimental melded with the structured. This was exactly what was done by Moa Pillar. Project of Moscow native Fyodor Pereverzhev, a sound designer by trade, his music is labeled as Sacred Bass Techno and Deconstructed Club. I first stumbled on his Humanity release back in 2015 when I was perusing the eMusic public pages, which were like music-oriented Facebook groups but in VK, the Russian social media network. Moa Pillar has been releasing his music on the now defunct Russian electronic music label Full of Nothing before creating his own... Wait, you know what? This is boring. Let's get straight to the music. I entered his world through the 2015 LP Humanity. Humanity is Moa's sophomore release. It vividly invigorates the usual techno structures with the best and most imaginative practices of modular sound design. A real breathing soundscape, Humanity shows a hazed-out world of automated human interaction. Cacophonic, colossal, and otherworldly. Humanity would be a great soundtrack to Tsutomu Nihei's manga Blame, where originally human-designed architecture spirals out into inhuman megaliths, filling out the whole solar system. Single elevator rides could take up to 80 years. It is human and alien at the same time. Grey, minimalist, yet detailed. The sound design techniques are in full display here. The tracks are long and lull you into a trance, a ritual dance which might not end within your lifespan. Crazy oscillations made by modular synths and warped, misty samples form the bed of the music. Though it is doubtless this LP is experimental and revolutionary in nature, it is far from a difficult listen. Some listeners might be apprehensive of my descriptions, as this is part of the course for any deconstructed club release. The difference is that Moa Pillar conforms the organic, wonky, weird and spiky textures to a world of danceable rhythm, something that deconstructed club releases often fail at. Humanity is not a subversion or a statement. It is a pure work of art, combining the experimental with the ordinary, bold and orderly. In my opinion, the best art pieces follow a similar logic, which is somewhat of a bias I have. Onto the track highlights. The first track starts with a mutating, clocked tremolo of samples and some corny fairy tale chords going off in the background. I'm a fan of wordless voice samples. This steady rhythm of abruptly cut gasps breaks into a hopping bass that pulls the rest of the track in a steady gait. A good starter, but far from my favorite. I might be mistaken, but I think those are the legendary avant-garde vocalist Meredith Monk's samples here, since Moa Pillar has used them in other projects as well. Second track, Essence, is a ghostly and hypnagogic ambient track, a warbled ancient memory of a childhood spent in a village, like a walk in some magical eerie woods. The wheezing of a tired harmonica, vaguely rustic melancholic vocal samples, crooning around sharp, stabby, synthy textures. I never skip this track on re-listens, even though it is an ambient piece. It is that good. Third track, Peace Walker, is a banger through and through. The track starts like you stepped into a dark, secret basement rave, and a delirium of a bad trip grabs hold of your faculties. The bass drop is like a massive head-front collision with a landslide. The whole track sounds like something big, bad, and evil is sleeping and is near awakening. In the end though, the slumber thankfully continues. The fourth track, Surrender, is a great focused dance number with songs of atonal metallic wails and a grinding bass line. The fifth track, Magnets, empty, eerie, magnificent and mysterious. An ambient piece about an industrial collapse or some important civilization going into an eternal sleep. Last track, Humanity, is like a shattered glass puzzle forming back into its original form by some alien logic. Not a nitpick, but a grievance. I'm not a big fan of mixing on this album, and some other Moa's albums as well. I find the lower frequencies to be a bit borrowed in the mix. Most of his music is very top-heavy, so to speak. Maybe it's my crappy listening apparatus, the Humies call headphones, but the kick and bass really seem to be undermanaged in the mix. That said, I love this record. It's not as self-conscious and controlled as more recent releases down the line, but it's unique, creative and emotional. Moa's sound design is spiky, alien and cold, stylistically comparable to sharpness of a blade. Sorry for the cringy analogy from Warhammer, but it's the music of the Drukhari murder parties that would splinter the cold air of Komorrag. I also like that, though kind of melancholic, there isn't really a set emotional direction, not overtly pessimistic or optimistic. Humanity is just human. It is busy, self-centered, chaotic. I would give this LP a 9 out of 10. Moa references this James Holden release as some of his inspiration for Humanity. In his own words, the Inheritors put modular synths in a usable and interesting musical context. James Holden shows them off as a rough-cut and imperfect gem, outfitting the modular synths with a real human mask. The whole album is a duo of drums plus modular synthesis, described by Moa Pillar as cacophony at times, but in a good sense. Before Humanity, there were a couple of Wonky and glitch hop albums in Moa Pillar's discography. These starting points show off an interest in ethnic and folk timbres and textures, mostly sampled at this point. The folklore leanings were later abandoned after Moa played some electronic stuff to traditional Caucasus musicians. and they weren't that interested in splicing the old with the new. Their mission was preservation, while Piotr was experimenting. But as Moa Pillar has put it in his interviews, he lost interest in reproducing folklore in his music since he became more skillful in terms of sound design. With proper synthesis, the warmth and earthy timbres of traditional instruments could be remade in a DAW. Not finding his place in the world of glitch hop, a pivot happened, and the third album, Humanity, became not just a switch of genres for the Moscow producer, but also transitioned to a different toolset. The rest of his discography, in my opinion, can be described as a honing of skills and a path of bridging the human and synthetic together. As a no-name music producer myself, I can really relate to spending too much time on finding yourself, searching for your sound, especially when a lot of genres speak to you and it's not really the bindings of a specific genre you seek, but a proper vehicle for your message and creative energy. I'm also a rabid fan of Wonky, and I find the sound to be underappreciated in the modern context of popular music. Even Wonky producers, they all gradually let the genre to rot away, sadly. At least we have their bones to pick though. Hymns is where Moa Pillar really tries to zero in on the sacred or religious aspect of his music. An admirable goal, since techno is very conducive to putting you in a trance-like state. Let's see if Moa manages to reach this lofty goal. First track, The Sun Stood Still. On this track we can hear that Moa Pillar has upped his sound design game with dynamic waves of noise spilling on a trickling synth arpeggio and rolls of synthetic drums. Distant choir vocals spike through the synthetic noise. Kicks go so fast they turn into a rumbling, pulsating tone. Static noise builds up around it to reveal sharp tones, piercing every other sound in the mix. Headache-inducing electric storm that builds up to a silent death. No bass drop follows. No, it is not time to start dancing. The track has ended and a new one has begun. There, a faint, hollow and coldly beautiful voice coos in the cosmic void. Industrial, atonal and sharp blades of synth noise build mountains in the black nothingness. Tectonic bass explosions vibrate across each other. A wintry melody, ripped straight out of a retro game, sparkles on top of a slowly growing rhythm. You're inside an elevator that is flying into the clouds. At last the doors open and you're at a rave right in the sky. As the doors slid open, the sound became fatter, close and real. The music becomes more intense and you're lost in the dance. Naked, raw, square wave synths shoot around. Squares are my favorite wavetable, by the way. A heavenly and dissonant chord arpeggio enters the fray to accent the already hissing, sharp synth textures of the lead melody. A minor nitpick is again the inconsistent mixing, as this drop part really needs a better balance with the lower frequencies. I would like more dynamics on this track though. I don't think the main body is deep enough, sonically speaking of course. This track yearns for some more switch-ups. As is, all the progression of this track just adds or brings some minor detail or another instrument into the mix, but doesn't really change anything drastic enough. Knife play. Dying echoes of glass shards start the track off. It feels like we are in space on psychedelics, and the silence around us begins to breathe and come alive. Soon we recognize the shadowy contours of a cave. A remnant of a cold blizzard is crawling inside the entrance to it. We follow it outside the cave and hear an alien creature akin to a mountain goat cry in the distance. The sound becomes close, synthetic and atonal. With it, the whole mountain crumbles. Rolls of tribal toms lift us up. A shimmery, warbled melodies playing underneath. The world opens up. We are atop a peak of one of these alien mountains. The rave continues. Chattering claps sound off as a whale's song rises with the many suns. This wailing synth is accompanying the rumble of drums. Some percussion is played slightly glitched, like with a very faint and subtle bit-reducted ghost note playing after them. Though I like that each track up to this point is like a breathing organism, ever-changing, vibrating, and moving about. I still think that some more variety is really needed on these tracks. A consistent experience, yes, but too linear to my taste. It deserves a listen, but probably won't attract you for a second visit. Oh, and the transition of tone glitching synths is repeated too many times on this track. Rich and textured, but really starved for melodic and rhythmic variety. And the moon stopped. You are lost in a windy blizzard. Your past life is nothing now. Only spikes and edges of shadows dancing at the back of your brain. Echoes of voice, not even full letters, sound off in the distant snowy valley. Not bad for an ambient track, but doesn't meet the expectations Moa Pillar has set himself for these kinds of pieces. The track meanders and at some point seems to be yearning for a focal point to dance around. I like the jittery glitches, which sound like they have been swallowed by some granular synth. Previously, Moa's ambient pieces would really strike a nerve with me. Not this time though. It's not bad by any stretch, and deserves a listen, but seems like just any other track with the drums pulled out. Also, the track really takes its time to fizzle out, the outro being kind of boring sonically. With the pretty fixed down soundscape this track has, the 8-minute runtime is a bit undeserved. Cups, the final track. Waking up in the forest floor amid foliage, closing off all the light above you, awakened by sounds of alien insects bringing themselves closer to you. Their wings beating, legs scratching, mandibles hissing. Now this is some cool sound design that brings real variety, much needed at this point. Cricket chirps and a deep distant rumble of some big tree cutting machine thundering through the tree trunks. I like the metallic singing bowls that we hear during the build-up, maybe some physical modeling synth. During the drop, the richly timbered snares crackle in their weird small reverbs. They sound like they're reverberating against the cave wall. Really cool track, sounds like the forest vibes of a gas record, but with much more contemporary and bold sound design, and with an actually danceable rhythm. Though I would really drop the lead synth, since its sound is really overused on 2 of the albums we have discussed, plus it plays in just a 4x4 rhythm without an interesting melody or groove. At some point we hear a cooing bird-like sound, we get some nice wood percussion with a chorus effect. At some point though, the main groove gets stale. Unfortunately, the track doesn't reach the highs of an experienced electronica. The ending track deserves more architecture, more polish, variety and movement. I think the interesting build-ups, intros and outros really outshine the dance parts of this album, which become stale and boring pretty quick. Hymns has interesting microdynamics with each track shedding its skin, moving and breathing like an animal. But in the same sense, the album lacks any macro dynamics. The tracks lack interesting progressions and shocking switch-ups. The idea of downing this record in religious gowns is admirable, but it seems that the sacred drapery fell off rather quick. Hymns does sound epic, grandiose, ecstatic, and if not for a very deliberate anxiety-induced thriller bend to its sound and textures, I would really think this stuff deserves some Magic Mushroom company. But the choir vocals played only a minor role in the soundscape of this record. Without them being more pronounced, I don't know where else this album is sourcing its religious inspiration from. It would be an error to interpret the epic scale and ecstatic atmosphere as religious invocation. I don't think this album is really so heavenly, except some short-lived specific points. What this album loses in dynamics, it compensates in pure cinematic atmosphere and dense overgrowth of sound art. I would give this record a 6 or 7 out of 10. No Expectations. In comparison to Hymns, No Expectations sounds like a collection of bangers and hits, while Hymns is the more conceptual release that rewards you with a deep experience, even if a little uneven at times. No Expectations is exactly what the title suggests, a no-nonsense array of groovy dance numbers with no strings attached. The first track, Closed Curve. The track starts off with a sound that is similar to a guitar string if it was made from some sort of crystalline sci-fi material. With some chiseled bass textures and gargantuan trailer music percussion hits, the track really builds up fast. The angular acoustic tries to build itself from the ground up, but keeps crumbling back down to start collecting itself anew. We get a cool transition near the end in the last third. The synths change up the rhythm and melody, and we get these manipulated vocal samples. This track is great. I actually think this is the most archetypical Moa Pillar sound, encapsulated in one single short, by his standards at least, banger. The second track, No Expectations. The titular track delivers synths even sharper than before, and more of the glitchy vocals. Moa Pillar is taking the stereotypical techno toolset and breaking it apart into an experimental, deconstructed explosion. This track has a fantastic groove, really one of the greatest of all of his tracks. Not since humanity have we heard a groove so danceable and entrancing. Though again, I would correct the mixing a bit to give the bass a bit more space. A roll of vocal chops, anxiety-inducing synth waves, and all this is in a call and response structure that really is as simply joyful as the robot rock Daft Punk track. Moa Pillar has seemingly carved his style in a more streamlined format with a mass appeal factor. It is still unmistakably his style, his typical tricks and sound design, but in a more dynamic and contrasted matrix. Hard recommendation. The third track, Drifting. An outstanding Moa Pillar mid-album ambient piece. Eerie vocals and a tremoloed shout bring us into a dark and twisted fairy tale. Tremolo of misty synths lines up like garden walls up to a large, decrepit gate. Polyrhythmic duets of grainy synth chords pair nicely with the dangling chains of ringing vocal chops. In contrast to the usual cold and alien alloy of electronic ambient that Moa employs, this track is lush and soft. Not to spoil the rest of the track, we will move on, but it is really a beauty to listen to. I love how drums get reincorporated back into the track, but yet still in an ambient context. Though I would shorten it to 6.5 minutes, as it overstays it welcome by just a smidge. Time like curve. The bass hits hard. I like the sidechained rhythm on the melodic elements. A warm vocal plays around with a sound that reminds me of the trill of a coin toss. Inner Pressure. This track starts with a Tubular Bells level of thrilling horror jingle, paired with the unquantized 808 bass thuds, the villainous melody, and the metallic noises. This all kind of reminds me of trap music, but only a little bit. It really sounds like its name, Inner Pressure, building up before a headache becomes fatal. Helix Loop. I couldn't believe the short runtime of this baby of a track. Sounds like an intro to a liturgy track. I was kind of scared of it exploding into black metal at some point. Not that interesting though, just a little sound art piece. Overall, Moa dials down on his sound design and prioritizes memorability and structure. This album is a much simpler listen, being full of bangers. No Expectations roots itself in rough and deep bass and builds upon the foundation with slicing synth textures and glitched vocal chops. More focused and on point than Hymns, No Expectations soars high, but not attaining the conceptual and sonic depth of Humanity. This music is ought to be in a soundtrack to some sci-fi movie. 8 out of 10. Well-balanced Rollback. This album is described in the Bandcamp description as minimalist mutant dance music. On this release, Moa Pillar dials down his sound design to let these short and simple instrumentals breathe. A cool concept for an album, but I found the result to be underwhelming. Since Moa's strength is sound design and not melody, as he admits himself, albeit in old interviews, the concept is not playing up to Moa's strengths. Minimalist dance tracks based on short micro samples is a cool concept again, but it's too tight of a squeeze, and going in without melody is a broken idea. The result is a collection of bangers which you can bop your head to while it's on, but none of them too memorable to stay in your head for longer than a day. The first track sounds just like a diary entry for a non-eventful day, just some uninspired sound art that overstays its welcome. The second track, Broken Rhythm, sounds nice from the get-go with its industrial toxic bass rhythm that leaves you headbanging. Not a fan of the windy synths on top though. They sound out of place and don't add much. Also, this track could be half its length. The third track really needs some more time on the mixing table with its headache-inducing highs. Speaking on other highlights, Primitive is just great, in the style of the previous album. Balance is cool too. Rollback is an epic ambient piece. It's nothing to write home about in terms of innovative sound design, but at this point, it's more important that the piece is massive and you can lose yourself in it. I love the effect of automating the size of reverb. Sounds very trippy. It sounds like an alien ocean ribbed with titanic waves. 5 out of 10. Since we're on this topic, I will make a playlist in Spotify with all of Moa Pillar's ambient tracks. You can listen to them in the description of the video. Sometime in 2021, Moa Pillar has created his own label, Pir, a label for like-minded, deconstructed club artists. I wanted to dedicate some time to the highlights of this record label, but soon found myself completely overwhelmed with the sheer variety of styles and amount of content on this label. This is totally out of the scope for this video, plus many of Pir's artists deserve their own videos. So I will mention my favorites, which I have been listening to for some time already. First suggestion, Rapid Antics. He has a more direct and in-your-face approach to the deconstructed sound, very intense and danceable stuff. I'm saddened by the fact that he doesn't release too much. Second suggestion is Wolf Love, who is as unconventional in his stylings as his name might suggest, joining industrially tinged neo-grime beats with Latino and African folk influences. And my third suggestion, Wait, UK as well? Damn, Moa really did take all of his friends with him, did he? I could only wish for friends like that. In all seriousness, major respect on Moa's part here. Just imagine a friend doing that for you. And considering it's his label, it's basically more like a boss than a friend even. Imagine your boss or a friend helping you out and getting you out of the autocratic shithole country you're stuck in. Major respects. And then after the well-balanced Rollback LP, nothing. Silence. For quite a few years. Well, not nothing. Something was released on his label. For instance, these art gallery companion pieces. There was also more production made for and with Ushka. Of course, Moa's silence was not unmotivated. The first anything we would hear from Moa Pillar after the start of the war was the Beyond Good and Evil track. This was to come out when Fyodor was already in the UK. After the war with Ukraine started in 2022, many Russian musicians, as well as activists, liberal-minded intellectuals, digital nomads, and other anti-war folk, have left the country for good. Fyodor was one of them as well. Uprooted from his Moscow locale, he left for Armenia, which with Georgia was one of the most popular destination points for all Russian anti-war migrants. As he says it himself in an interview, while in Armenia he would be homestuck for 2 months before actually engaging with the new reality of exiled life abroad. At some point he managed to use his prior connections in the music world to help him acquire a global talent visa and emigrate to the UK. He found himself living in the suburbs of East London. In a strange twist of fate, he found himself surrounded by his own influences. It is no secret that UK is insanely influential in terms of electronic music, and has been for a while and will be in the future. Harboring a large migrant population from all around the world helps, of course. Britain has been a melting pot of sounds from various cultures for a long time now. Dub, reggae, trip-hop, IDM, garage, dubstep. You know what? I will never fit all British contributions to electronic music in a single video. You get the point. Moa says that for some time now, Germany was the more popular inspiration for the Moscow electronic scene, but not for him personally, and I share Moa's preference for the UK scene as well. Fyodor talks about how in London it is much more normal to be yourself, to weird out, but at the same time he feels like all your peculiarities are kind of lost in the noise. Something that would be deemed fringe and be posted in an obscure Russian music media would find itself safely atop a giant billboard in London. This speaks to the conservative Russian monoculture. I also left Russia back in 2023. Not everyone had a tech career or a remote job or was lucky to have relatives in other countries. So there are a lot of us just sort of aimlessly flowing about in various countries where you can do that, at least for some time. For a frame of reference, it's of course not as bad as being a refugee. It's not equal to being a digital nomad as well, as you don't have a constant or a specific home to return to. I can attest to the abyss of negative experiences, emotions, and mental breakdowns that this experience bestows on you, especially if, like in my case, it hasn't ended yet. Here we have crept upon Moa's last release, brewed in the depths of this upheaval. Released in 2025, The Boots of Blinding Speed is Moa's most recent album. Since I described its background, let's skip the intro and hop right into the track highlights. Hypnotized. This track has this short, burp-like sound which goes through the entire track. The track keeps cycling through various phases and instruments right up to the end, always moving about, breathing with you, and not staying in one place for too long. The intensity is gradually brewing throughout the track, and it can be compared to an auditory anxiety attack or an Acura-esque motorcycle chase. Through the swamps of Wardenfell, I presume, another Moa ambient piece, wonderful track. It channels some eerie energy with the use of ghostly vocal samples and some synth sounds. At the last third we get a sound reminiscent of a guitar, which is very surprising for a Moa release. I would like to also commend the progression and movement on this track. It has a focal point, a spine, or a pillar, if you will, onto which it entangles itself, but all of its curls and spirals that it makes are new and unique. Some of the previous ambient pieces which I didn't like were lacking exactly this adventurous energy and constant flow. Expertly executed, this piece does not get boring. Mule, a grimy banger with distorted bass and drums. The sub-bass whirls remind me of Neurofunk, and the sleek urban vibe reminds me of Gesaffelstein. Growling and nasty bass sells this track on its own, but all the other additions only add to the mean, toxic atmosphere of an urban scrapyard. Real, we get a breather featuring Ushka. There is a nice unquantized Wonky beat moving this track and some haunting vaporwave oriented vocal menagerie. The title track sounds like 1-0 Tricks Point Never Worship in the best sense possible. Again, just because it's an ambient piece doesn't mean it has to be boring and static, and this is a great example. This piece is anything but. The interplay of samples, noise, and effects on this piece is like a valley you have to navigate, and the journey is always taking you to new places. Chains, a whirlpool of sounds that is asking to get lost in. Rollback sounds like a thumping and rattling rave with a machine gun going off somewhere outside as backing. Ballroom stutters till it explodes with color like a flower bud. Komitasa is some very epic PS1 era ambient jungle that soars high. The aggression and doom that pierces the record like a narrative through pages of a novel remind of the migration that Moa had to undergo. I relate too strongly to his journey, and this record is a great sonic illustration of the fear, anxiety, and hopelessness a lot of Russian people had to go through leaving their country in voluntary exile. Of course, notwithstanding my bias, the record is truly an evolution for Moa. It is wildly diverse, not focusing on his previous techno records. Moa has successfully bridged out to other dance genres on this record while perfecting his sound art. At this point, I think even if Moa switches to doing exclusively noise and electroacoustic improvisations and ambient pieces, I will still follow and like whatever he does. I score this album 8 out of 10. Don't focus on my nitpicks too much in this video. I'm still a fan of Moa Pillar, don't get me wrong. I've also managed to catch him live. I think it's okay to critique even your favorite artists, and he's still one of my biggest inspirations in my own music I do, up there with Aphex Twin and other greats. I first listened to Moa Pillar in 2015, and his sound and style is still bold and innovating. A long time from my teen years, I've become a depressed, unemployed adult, and now I vibe more with I Hate Models, again, which is my favorite gym music. But while I Hate Models is more about negative, aggressive energy, industrial hellscapes, and for some weird reason, breakups on the last album, Moa's sound is about transcendence, about ecstatic states of mind, about humanity, and nature's endless conflict. Moa has taught me a lot about what can be done with sound alone, how paired with a relatively simple genre, you get comparatively more freedom to build out progressions and toy with noises. Moa has showed me how a techno album can boil up some very deep emotions, and man, just close your eyes while listening to his music. I mean, if you think I have trippy imagination, try it for yourself. With his style, it's impossible not to imagine some cool stuff. His style is remarkable to a point that I can always tell that I'm listening to his tracks. Matter of fact, that can be said of a lot of guys from his label too. This is the best deconstructed club music that I've listened to, that still manages to deconstruct as well as to club. PS, a short aside, the track you hear in the background are some techno B-sides I created a long time ago, and probably won't publish as complete tracks on a real release, but it's techno and it was inspired by Moa Pillar back then. I found a lot of points to relate to Moa Pillar during this journey through his discography. I have been always on the move the last 3 years of my life. Constant migration, chaos, no job, no money, no stability. I traveled to a different destination though. I traveled east through Kazakhstan, India, and now I'm still a nomad with no home, lost somewhere in East Asia. Of course, it wasn't all bad. I saw some really beautiful things, and the staggering amount of experience I acquired during these 3 years of traveling is unprecedented. And even though I would love to end this experience and find a permanent home, I am still pretty grateful for what I've gone through. I think it has been a real transformative experience. I too have a Central Asian 2-string bowed instrument and some beaten up analog synths I took with me, and an all-consuming desire to create music. So that is what I will do, and that is my biggest takeaway from this journey. I will go and create something weird and electronic. I also share Moa Pillar's love for modular synthesis, though I have negative money, so I use the free version of VCV rack instead of actual gear. By the way, one thing I didn't have time to review in this video are the numerous smaller releases from Moa Pillar. Most of them are ambient pieces or just simple techno, which wasn't very interesting to talk about in this video. But some of these pieces were kind of interesting to at least conceptualize and listen to once. Like 20 plus minutes of ambient made on Moa Pillar's modular setup. And one question I have for other modular owners, if you are watching this, is where's your 20 plus minute ambient piece on Bandcamp? I would really love to listen to it, and if you do have one, please send it in the comments. You know what, actually disregard that previous comment. There's a very low probability that actual millionaires will watch my first video on YouTube, so forget the modular comment, just send your stuff if you have any. I will try to give them a listen. As I said before, I have also compiled a Spotify playlist of my favorite Moa's ambient tracks. You can find the link in the description. Check it out. Good luck, and please check out Moa Pillar's discography wherever you can find it.